crack of a whip sliced through the dry Texas air. Then silence. Dust hung heavy in the noon sun, the kind that burns your skin just by standing still. On a wooden platform stood a girl, barefoot, wrists bound in rusted iron. She didn't flinch when the auctioneer barked her age, 17. Didn't move when the crowd shifted, sizing her up like they were picking cattle instead of a person. The war had ended 4 years ago, but the trade of desperation still thrived in secret barns and back alleys, places where men with greed in their veins made a profit off broken souls. "Next one," the auctioneer called, his voice sharp and oily. "No husband, no kin. Been sold 3 times already. Won't talk, won't work. $5 to start," the crowd murmured. No one moved. A man spat in the dirt. "Ain't worth feeding." The girl's name was Lena Cartwright. Her dress was torn, her skin streaked with dust and sun. A bruise bloomed under her cheekbone. Her hair clung to her face, hiding most of her expression, but her eyes were empty. She'd stopped crying a long time ago. "Come on, folks," the auctioneer barked. "Somebody's got to need cheap labor." Still nothing. Then a voice came from the back. Calm, deep, steady. "I'll pay 20. Heads turned. A man in a worn brown coat stepped forward. Gray hair at his temples, a jaw like stone, and eyes that had seen too much of the world to be surprised by anything. Grant McCade, 56. A rancher known for keeping to himself, known even more for the kind of silence that comes from guilt. 20? The auctioneer repeated, half laughing. "For her?" Grant nodded once. 20! The gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Sold." Lena didn't react. Didn't even look up when the auctioneer shoved her forward. She stumbled and Grant caught her by the arm. For the first time, he saw her face clearly, and his heart stilled. That scar, thin, crescent-shaped, just below her wrist. He'd seen it before. 8 years ago. He'd wrapped that wound himself. Back then, she'd been a child hiding behind her father's leg, asking if it would leave a mark. He'd told her no. He'd lied. She looked up at him now, green eyes dulled by too many years of cruelty, and there wasn't a flicker of recognition. Maybe she didn't remember. Maybe she did, and wished she hadn't. Grant swallowed the ache in his throat. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's get you out of here." He handed the last of his money to the auctioneer and walked her out into the blazing sun. The crowd went back to its business, the sound of another gavel echoing behind them. Another life sold, another debt paid. But for Grant McCade, this one wasn't about pity. It was about redemption. They walked for miles down the dirt road, the wind whipping dust across the plains. Grant led the way, reins in one hand, hat shading his eyes. Behind him, Lena followed, the faint clink of her chains trailing through the still air like an accusation. He could feel her distrust with every step. When they stopped at an oak tree for shade, he pulled a key from his pocket and unlocked the shackles from her wrists. "No one should wear those in a free country," he muttered. She rubbed her wrists, red and raw, but didn't thank him. Didn't say anything, just stared. Grant offered her his canteen. "Here," he said. She hesitated before taking it. 1 sip, 2. Then she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and met his eyes. Her voice came out quiet but sharp. "Guess you got what you paid for." "Go ahead, do what you want." Grant froze. The words hit like a bullet to the chest. "I didn't buy you," he said finally, voice rough. "I paid to stop them from selling you again." She let out a small, bitter laugh. "You think that makes it better?" He didn't argue. There wasn't anything he could say that wouldn't sound like a lie. They sat in silence, the heat pressing down like punishment. After a long while, Grant spoke again. "I knew your family once. Your father, Robert Cartwright. He was a good man." Lena turned away. "Everybody says that after it's too late." Grant didn't push. He just sat there, eyes fixed on the road ahead, dust clinging to the sweat on his hands. He wondered how long it would take before she stopped seeing him as another monster in a long line of them, or if she ever would. And somewhere deep down, under the weight of his guilt, he wondered, what would she do when she found out the truth? The road home stretched long before them, but the hardest miles weren't made of dirt. They were made of memory. By the time they reached Grant's ranch, the sun was melting behind the distant hills, painting the plains in copper and dust. The world around them was quiet, too quiet, the kind that made even the crickets hold their breath. Grant dismounted and tied his horse near the corral. He turned toward Lena, who still sat stiffly in the saddle, her hands clutching the reins like she expected him to strike her. "You can sleep in the cabin," he said finally, nodding toward a small wooden shack near the barn. "There's a stove, water barrel out back. It ain't much, but it's safe." Lena slid down from the horse. Her bare feet sank into the dirt. She didn't thank him, didn't ask questions. She just looked toward the cabin with cautious eyes, like a trapped animal assessing a cage. Inside, the air smelled of pine and dust. One bed, one table, one chair. A cracked window let in the fading light. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping in. Grant set down a loaf of bread and a small jar of preserves on the table. "For supper," he said. Lena's lips parted, like she might say something, but then she just nodded. He turned to leave, hat in hand, pausing at the door. "You can stay as long as you need. No one will bother you here." She looked up, her voice quiet but edged. "You don't have to pretend to be kind. I've seen what kindness costs." He hesitated. "Maybe it's time it costs me something." Then he walked out, leaving her alone with the bread, the shadows, and her thoughts. The next few days passed without words. Lena worked from sunrise to dusk, cleaning stalls, feeding the horses, hauling water from the well. She never complained, never smiled. The only sound she made was the rhythm of her work, the scrape of the bucket, the creak of wood, the whisper of straw. Grant watched from a distance. He repaired fences, mended the roof, fixed the porch steps that had been loose for years. Every so often, he'd glance toward the barn where Lena moved like a ghost among the animals. At night, she'd sit outside the cabin beneath the stars, her knees pulled close, her hands resting on the scarred wood of the porch rail. Sometimes he'd catch her staring at the horizon, the same direction the Cartwright farm had once stood before it burned. He'd light a pipe on the porch of his house, watching from afar, wondering if she knew he carried part of that fire in his own hands. On the third day, the sound of hooves broke the quiet. Grant straightened from where he'd been fixing a wagon wheel. Dust rose on the horizon, 3 riders approaching fast. When the glint of a silver badge caught the light, his jaw tightened. Sheriff Dalton Grant had known he'd show up eventually. Men like Dalton always did. They had a way of sniffing out ghosts. The riders slowed as they neared the ranch. The sheriff dismounted, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Well, I'll be damned," he said with a smirk. "If it ain't old Grant McCade. Thought you'd gone soft out here." Grant wiped the sweat from his brow. "Not soft, just tired." Dalton's eyes drifted past him, to the girl near the barn, pitchfork in hand, frozen mid-motion. His smirk faltered for half a second, then returned. "Now that's a face I didn't expect to see again." Lena's stomach twisted. The man's voice dragged up memories she'd buried, the smell of smoke, the screams, the night everything was taken from her. Grant stepped between them. "You've had your look." Dalton laughed, pulling at his gloves. "You buying girls now, Grant?" "Thought you were done playing savior." "I paid for her freedom," Grant said, his voice low, steady. "That's all?" The sheriff's smirk widened. "Freedom, huh? That what you call it these days? I remember that name, Cartwright. Her daddy was a traitor to the Union, wasn't he? Got what he deserved." Grant's jaw clenched. The air went heavy. Lena gripped the fence rail, her knuckles white. Her throat burned, but she said nothing. She'd learned long ago that silence could keep you alive. Dalton reached into his pocket and pulled out a single bullet. He set it on the fence post between them. "Just a reminder, Grant," he said softly. "Some ghosts don't stay buried." Then he turned and mounted his horse. The riders rode off, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake, and a silence that pressed against the chest like a stone. Grant didn't move for a long time. He stared at that bullet until the light shifted and shadows swallowed it. Behind him, Lena spoke for the first time in hours. "Who was that?" Grant's voice was barely a whisper. "Someone who should have been buried with the past." He turned toward the sunset. "But the past never dies easy out here." That night, thunder rumbled across the plains. Grant sat by the cabin fire, the glow flickering across his weathered face. Lena sat across from him, silent as ever, her shadow stretching along the wall. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, a silver pocket watch. Dented and old, she set it on the table between them. "Recognize it?" Grant froze. The initials, R.C., were faintly carved on the back. Robert Cartwright, her father. Lena's voice was calm, but it trembled underneath. I found it after the fire. I've kept it ever since. Grant's throat tightened. He'd buried that name deep. But some things have a way of finding their way back, like ashes that never truly blow away. He looked at her, and for the first time she didn't look like a stranger. She looked like the last living reminder of everything he'd done wrong. The rain came hard that night, hammering the roof of the cabin until it sounded like the sky itself was trying to wash the past away. Grant sat near the small fire, the flames flickering against the rough-hewn walls. Across from him, Lena was still, her face half hidden in shadow. Between them on the table sat the silver pocket watch, its tarnished case catching the firelight like an old wound refusing to close. Neither had spoken since she placed it there. But silence can say more than words ever could. Finally, Lena's voice broke through, low and deliberate. You knew him. My father, Grant nodded. The air in his lungs felt thick as smoke. I did. What really happened? The question hung between them, sharp as broken glass. Grant stared at the fire for a long time before he spoke. My father was a landman. After the war, he bought up property cheap from folks who lost everything. He wanted your family's land, the Cartwright place. Said it was rich soil, good for cattle, but your father wouldn't sell. Lena's eyes darkened, her jaw tightening. One night, soldiers came. Grant continued. They said Robert Cartwright was aiding the Confederacy. It was a lie. My father told them what they needed to hear so they'd burn it down and clear the deed. I overheard him that evening. He paused, his voice shaking for the first time. I tried to ride out there to warn your family, but by the time I got there it was already gone. The words cracked like wood splitting in the fire. Lena didn't move. She just stared, her face pale and unreadable. I was a coward, Grant whispered. I did nothing, and I've been trying to make up for it ever since. For a long time, all that filled the room was the storm and the fire. Lena reached for the pocket watch and closed her hand around it. Her knuckles turned white. You think telling me this makes it better? She asked. Grant shook his head. No, but you deserve to know who you're standing next to. Her breath hitched and she looked down. She wanted to hate him, needed to. But part of her, the small, fragile part that still remembered the world before it turned cruel, didn't know how anymore. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains. It sounded like the earth itself, remembering that night 8 years ago. After a long silence, Lena spoke again, softer now. If your father did all that, why are you the one carrying the guilt? Grant looked up, his eyes tired but steady. Because I was there. Because I did nothing. And because I'm still breathing when they're not. The fire popped. Lena flinched at the sound, then forced herself to meet his gaze. And for the first time since she'd met him, her anger wavered, not gone, but cracked just enough for the light to seep through. She didn't forgive him. Not yet. But for the first time, she saw him not as a captor, not as another cruel man with power, but as something else entirely. Another soul trying to make peace with ghosts that refused to stay buried. The storm outside quieted, leaving only the faint whisper of rain dripping from the eaves. Grant stood by the door, his revolver resting loosely in his hand. Old habits die hard. He'd learned that some ghosts ride horses. Lena sat near the hearth, turning the watch in her fingers. Her thoughts were a blur of images, the fire, her father's voice, the night she ran. But now another face lingered among those memories. Grant's, older and broken but honest. The silence between them wasn't the same anymore. It wasn't hollow. It was heavy, full of things neither knew how to say. When morning came, the world was washed clean. The ranch glowed under a pale sky, steam rising from the damp earth. Grant went out to mend the fence Dalton's men had broken weeks before. He worked slow, methodical, like a man trying to fix something more than wood. He didn't hear Lena approach until she spoke behind him. You're doing it wrong, she said dryly. Grant turned, startled. She was barefoot in the wet grass. Hair messy, sleeves rolled up, holding a hammer. He blinked. I am, she smirked faintly. You're putting the nails too close together. My father used to say wood needs room to breathe. Grant handed her the hammer without a word. She knelt beside him and started working. They didn't talk after that. They just worked side by side, the rhythm of the hammer and the wind replacing words. For the first time in years, the ranch didn't feel empty. That night, Grant carved 2 small wooden crosses from spare boards. He set them near the fence line under a willow tree. He didn't tell her what he was doing, but when she found him there, she didn't have to ask. Her breath caught when she saw the names carved into the wood. Robert Cartwright. Family. She knelt down, tracing the letters with trembling fingertips. Her tears came slow, quiet, like the kind that had waited too long to fall. When she finally stood, she pressed the pocket watch into Grant's hand. "I think it's time you keep it," she whispered. He shook his head. "No, it belongs to them," she smiled faintly. "Then let it stay here." And for the first time in 8 years, she walked away from the past without looking back. That night, Lena didn't sleep by the door. She sat by the window instead, watching the stars, and across the room, Grant finally allowed himself to breathe again. Days turned into weeks. The land began to heal in small, almost invisible ways, like the first shoots of green pushing through blackened soil. Lena stayed. She mended the fences, patched holes in the barn roof, and planted seeds in the hard spring ground. She didn't say much, but she didn't hide anymore either. There were moments when Grant would catch her humming softly while working by the trough, half a tune, broken and fragile, but it carried across the fields like forgiveness learning to speak. Grant found himself listening for it. He'd ride out at dawn to check the cattle, but his eyes always strayed toward the cabin, toward the woman who'd once flinched from his shadow and now walked freely across his land. One morning, he found her kneeling in the garden, hands deep in the dirt. "You'll ruin your dress doing that," he said from the gate. She glanced up, half smiling. "It's already ruined," he chuckled quietly. Fair point. The air between them had softened. It wasn't comfort, not yet, but it wasn't fear either. It was something in between. Something that might one day grow roots. A few nights later, thunder rolled again over the plains, but this time the storm was only in the distance. Grant sat on the porch, a mug of coffee in hand. Lena joined him after supper, pulling her shawl tight. For a while, they just watched the lightning far off across the valley. "I keep thinking about that night," she said finally, voice low. "The raid." Grant didn't look at her, but his hand tightened around the mug. "I remember the smell," she continued. "Smoke, iron, sweat. My father yelling for me to run." Her breath hitched. "I was too slow." Grant's voice was gentle. "You were a child. I still see it," she whispered. "The fire, the sky, everything we had just gone. And now I wonder if I ever really left that night." He set the mug down, leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Maybe none of us ever do. We just learn to live beside the fire." She studied him for a long moment. "And what about you, Grant McCade? You still living beside yours?" He met her eyes, tired but steady. Every day. The next morning the quiet was shattered. Lena had gone to the well when she saw it. Fresh tracks cutting across the road, too deep to be passing travelers. Boot prints, wagon wheels, and something else. Hoof marks that didn't belong to any horse on the ranch. She dropped the bucket and ran toward the house. "Grant!" He came out with his rifle slung over one shoulder, eyes narrowing. One look at the tracks and he knew. "Dalton," he muttered. Lena froze. "He's coming back?" "He never left," Grant said grimly. By noon, clouds gathered again, thick and gray, as if the land itself knew what was coming. Grant checked his rifle, loaded every chamber. He didn't want blood, but he'd seen enough of the world to know that men like Dalton only understood violence. Lena watched from the porch. "What do you want me to do?" "Stay inside," he said firmly. "I'm not hiding again." He looked at her then, really looked, at the strength in her shoulders, the fire in her eyes. The girl he'd found in chains was gone. What stood before him was something else entirely. "All right," he said quietly, "but stay close." By sunset, the first riders appeared on the ridge. Dalton in front, his badge glinting like a lie. 2 deputies flanked him, rifles across their saddles. "Evening, Grant," the sheriff called, that same smirk painted on his face. "Heard you been sheltering a fugitive." Grant stood in the yard, rifle slung at his side. "She's no fugitive. She's free," Dalton laughed. "Free? You think you can just decide that, huh? That girl's property by law, hell, by my law." Lena stepped forward then, standing beside Grant. "Your law burned my home." The sheriff's smile twitched. "You should have stayed gone, girl." He turned to his men. "Take her." But before they could move, Grant raised his rifle. "You'll have to go through me." The air went dead still. Even the wind stopped moving. Dalton dismounted, slow, deliberate. His boots crunched against the gravel. "You sure you want to do this, old man?" he asked softly. Grant's finger hovered over the trigger. "I should have done it 8 years ago." The sheriff's hand dropped to his pistol. A single crack split the air. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Dalton staggered back, clutching his shoulder. His pistol fell into the dirt. Grant hadn't aimed to kill, just to stop him. Dalton's men froze, eyes darting between their wounded leader and the rancher with the steady rifle. "Take him," one of them muttered, grabbing the sheriff under the arm. They hauled him back to his horse. Dalton glared through the pain. "This ain't over," he hissed. "You hear me? It's never over." Grant lowered his gun. "It is now." The men rode off into the fading light, leaving only the smell of gunpowder and rain. Lena stood beside him, her breath shaking. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," he said quietly. "Some debts don't get paid in words." She looked at him, her voice soft. "And some don't get paid in blood." He glanced toward her, and for the first time in years, his expression broke into something faint, almost human, a smile. That night, the ranch was silent again. But it was a different kind of silence this time. Not empty, not haunted, just still. Lena sat by the window looking out over the plains. The moon was high, the air cool, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel hunted. Grant stood on the porch, rifle leaning against the wall. The night wind brushing past him like an old friend. He knew the sheriff would heal. He knew others might come. But he also knew this land, his land, finally had something worth protecting again. Inside, the clock ticked softly. Lena turned toward the door. "Grant," she said quietly, "you can sit, you know. You don't have to keep watch all night." He smiled faintly, stepping inside. "Maybe I just like the view." She laughed softly, and for the first time the sound didn't hurt. The ghosts had gone quiet. For now, and that was enough. Morning broke warm and gold across the valley, sunlight spilling over the hills like a second chance. The storm had passed, the sheriff was gone, and for the first time in years the McCade Ranch felt alive again. Grant woke early, the way men do who've lived too long by routine. He stepped outside, boots sinking into soft earth, and took a long breath of the clean air. The scent of wet sage, the distant call of a hawk. It was the kind of quiet he hadn't known since before the war. Inside, Lena was already awake. He found her in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, her hair tied back, kneading dough in a wooden bowl. He stopped in the doorway, watching. "You cook now?" he teased. She didn't look up. "Someone has to keep you alive." Fair enough. For a moment he just stood there, taking in the sight. The light from the window hit her face in a way that made her look younger, like the girl she might have been if the world had been kinder. He cleared his throat and stepped forward. "You don't have to do all that. You've already done enough." She smirked faintly. "You say that like you think I can't cook." "Oh, I didn't say that," he replied. "I just remember the last time you tried to fix that stove." She turned, glaring at him over her shoulder. "That was your fault. You gave me damp kindling." He grinned, and the sound of it surprised even him. It felt strange, foreign to laugh again. By midday they were working side by side in the fields, mending fences and checking the livestock. The easy rhythm of shared work had replaced the silence that used to hang heavy between them. Once she stumbled, tripping on a loose board. Grant caught her by the arm, steadying her before she fell. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. Neither moved. Her breath caught, and she quickly pulled back, brushing dirt from her skirt. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Any time," he murmured. It was a small thing, barely a moment, but it shifted something between them. The distance they'd both clung to started to fade, replaced by something fragile and real. That evening, they sat together by the porch steps, the sun dipping low beyond the ridge. Lena held a small cup of tea, steam curling into the cooling air. Grant stared out toward the pasture. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. "Every day," she said honestly. He nodded slowly. "Then why don't you?" She looked down at her hands. "Because I wouldn't know where to go. The world out there." She paused, searching for words. "It's full of men like Dalton. Places like that barn. I'm tired of running from one fire into another." Grant's voice was low. "You're safe here." She glanced at him. Safe doesn't mean free. He turned to her, his gaze steady. Then what does? She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides a wound. I don't know. Maybe I'll find out. He wanted to tell her that freedom wasn't just land or law, it was peace. And maybe she'd already found a piece of it here. But he didn't. Some truths aren't ready to be spoken out loud. Days bled into one another. Spring turned to summer. The wheat fields grew tall and gold. The cattle grazed lazily under the open sky. And somewhere between the long days and quiet nights, the ranch became something it hadn't been in years. A home. Lena began tending to small things. The garden, the clothesline, even a tiny patch of flowers near the porch. Grant never said anything, but every time he passed those flowers, he found himself smiling. She'd started humming again, too, softly under her breath while she worked. The sound followed him everywhere, like sunlight chasing shadows. And sometimes, late at night, he'd wake to see her sitting by the window, looking at the stars. He never asked what she was thinking. He figured she'd tell him when she was ready. Then, one evening near dusk, a rider appeared on the horizon. Grant spotted him first, a lone figure cutting across the ridge. He tensed, hand instinctively dropping to the rifle leaning by the door. Lena stepped out beside him. Is it Dalton? He squinted, then shook his head. No, someone else. The rider slowed as he neared the gate, raising one hand in greeting. McCade, he called. You still fixin' fences for ghosts, or you got room for work that pays? Grant exhaled in relief. It was Harris Dunn, a rancher from downriver. A good man, one of the few who'd stayed decent when the world went bad. Come on up, Grant said. Harris dismounted, dusting himself off. Heard about your run-in with Dalton. Man's been stirring trouble in every county from here to Abilene. He's gone, Grant said evenly. For now. Harris nodded, glancing at Lena. And you must be the one he was barking about in town. Lena's jaw tensed, but she stood tall. I imagine he said worse than my name. Harris smiled faintly. He did, but folks around here ain't all fools. They know who the real monsters are. She didn't answer, but her shoulders relaxed just a little. Grant poured 3 cups of coffee, and they sat under the porch awning as the sun sank. Harris leaned back in his chair. You know, Grant, for a man who swore off company, you sure picked an interesting way to prove yourself wrong. Grant chuckled softly. Guess life's got a funny way of humbling a man, Harris grinned. Or saving him. He tipped his hat to Lena before mounting up again. You take care of him, Miss Cartwright. That man's got a habit of collecting ghosts. She smiled. Just a flicker, but real. He's not the only one. Harris laughed, and his horse carried him down the trail until the dust swallowed him from view. When the night finally fell, the ranch was quiet again. The stars came out one by one, scattered across the sky like a promise. Lena lingered on the porch, arms folded. He's right, you know, she said softly. Grant looked up. About what? About ghosts. You've been living with them too long. He studied her for a long moment. Maybe, but lately they don't seem so heavy. She smiled faintly, her eyes glimmering in the lamplight. That's 'cause you've got company now. He laughed under his breath. Company, huh? That what you call yourself? She tilted her head. What would you call me? Grant hesitated, his voice low. The reason the place finally feels alive again. Lena blinked, taken aback. She looked away quickly, her cheeks flushed. Don't say things like that. Why not? Because I might believe you, she said softly. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The quiet between them said enough. The wind swept through the valley, rustling the wheat, carrying with it a peace neither had dared to hope for, and somewhere deep inside both of them, something unspoken began to bloom, something that felt a lot like love. The summer heat came early that year, the kind of heat that ripened the earth and made the air shimmer above the fields. Every morning, before the sun climbed too high, Grant and Lena worked side by side, hauling hay, mending fences, and tending to the herd. By noon, the sweat would cling to their skin, their clothes streaked with dust and effort. But there was something peaceful in the labor, something grounding. One morning, Lena was stacking feed sacks in the barn when Grant came in, carrying a bucket of water. Here, he said, setting it beside her. You'll burn yourself out if you keep pushing like that. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. You saying I can't keep up with you? He smiled faintly. Didn't say that. Just figured I'd share what's left of my shade. She laughed quietly, her voice soft but warm. For the first time in years, her laughter didn't sound like something broken. Grant leaned against a post, watching her. The light streaming through the cracks in the wood painted lines across her face. Her eyes were alive again, green, not hollow. It struck him suddenly just how much had changed since that day in the auction yard. She wasn't the frightened girl he'd bought for $20. She was a woman now, strong, stubborn, and unafraid to meet the world head-on. And in some quiet, aching corner of his chest, he realized he didn't just admire her, he needed her. That evening, the sky turned a deep orange as the sun sank behind the ridges. They sat on the porch together, the smell of honeysuckle drifting in from the edge of the field. Grant sipped his coffee while Lena mended a torn shirt. The silence between them had become something familiar, companionable. After a while, she spoke. "Do you ever think about leaving this place?" He chuckled softly. "What for?" "I don't know. You could start over somewhere, where nobody knows your name, where the past doesn't reach so far." He looked out at the land, the wide stretch of gold and green, the fences, the house, the barn rebuilt by hand. "This is where I belong," he said simply. "The good and the bad. I owe it that much." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You think it's possible, starting over without running away?" "I think it's the only kind worth doing," she smiled faintly. "Then maybe I'll try." Over the next few weeks, something subtle began to shift. Lena stopped flinching when he walked into the room. Grant stopped hiding behind silence. They ate their meals together, sometimes even talked about things that weren't heavy with pain. She told him about her father's old guitar, about the song he used to sing before the war. He told her about his mother, the one person who'd taught him gentleness before the world beat it out of him. One night, when the heat was too much to sleep, they sat outside beneath the stars. The crickets sang in the grass, and the air smelled of wildflowers and dust. Lena leaned back against the porch rail, her hair loose, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "It's strange," she said quietly. "For so long I hated silence. It used to remind me of everything I lost. But now—" She glanced at him, smiling softly. "Now it feels like peace." Grant's chest tightened. Maybe silence just needed the right company. She laughed under her breath. "You're getting good at saying things that sound like they mean more than they should." He looked at her, his voice low. "Maybe they do." For a heartbeat, neither moved. The night was still, the air charged. Then, before the moment could break, Lena stood and brushed her hands on her skirt. "You should get some rest, Grant." He nodded, watching her disappear into the cabin, but he didn't sleep. He stayed there under the stars until dawn, thinking about the way her laughter lingered like the scent of rain. The next morning, Grant found something strange in the dirt near the gate. Hoof prints, deep ones. He crouched, running a hand along the tracks. They were fresh, too fresh. His stomach turned. Dalton. He hadn't seen the sheriff since that night he'd shot him, but men like Dalton didn't forgive, and they didn't forget. Lena came out of the barn, a basket in her arms. "What is it?" "Tracks," he said. 3, maybe 4 horses, headed east toward the ridge. Her face paled. "You think it's him?" Grant stood, his expression grim. "I know it is." That night he sat by the fire cleaning his rifle. Lena watched from across the room, her hands twisting the hem of her dress. "You can't go after him," she said finally. He looked up. "If I don't, he'll come here." "You don't know that." "Yes, I do." She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "You've done enough. You gave me my freedom, you gave me peace. Don't throw that away for him." Grant's jaw tightened. "This ain't about me anymore. It's about making sure no one else burns because of what my father did." Lena's eyes glistened. "Then let me go with you." He froze. "No." "Grant," I said no. Her voice broke. "You can't keep protecting me from the world." "I've been running from it my whole life. Maybe it's time I face it." He looked at her then, really looked, at the strength in her, the same fire her father once carried. "I won't lose you," he said softly. "You won't." She whispered back. "Not if we ride together." Outside, the moon hung low and red, bleeding across the horizon. Grant saddled his horse, tightening the straps. Lena mounted hers beside him, silent but steady. The wind carried the smell of rain and danger. As they rode out under the dark sky, the dust rose behind them like ghosts. Grant glanced her way. "You sure about this?" She met his eyes. "I was sure the day you broke my chains." He nodded once, the faintest ghost of a smile on his lips. "Then let's finish what we started." They rode east toward the ridge, where the past waited for them like a storm that refused to die. The night air was sharp, carrying the dry scent of cedar and dust. The moon hung low over the hills as Grant and Lena rode side by side, their horses' hooves thudding softly against the hard ground. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them was full, of fear, of resolve, of everything they couldn't say aloud. By dawn, they reached the ridge. From up there, the land rolled endlessly, the horizon tinted with the faint blush of sunrise. Grant dismounted, scanning the valley below. Smoke. A thin curl of it rose from the tree line to the east, too controlled to be a campfire, too far from any homestead. He turned to Lena. "He's there." Her jaw tightened. "Then so are we." He gave her a long look, searching for hesitation. There was none. They tethered their horses in the brush and moved on foot. The closer they got, the heavier the air felt. It wasn't fear, it was memory. Every step brought Grant back to the night of the raid 8 years ago. The same scent of smoke, the same tremor in the ground, the same gnawing in his chest. Lena moved quietly behind him, her face set in stone. She had lived this fire once before. She wasn't running from it again. When they reached the clearing, they saw it, a small camp tucked behind the rocks. Dalton sat at the fire, his left arm still bandaged from the bullet Grant had put there. 2 men lounged nearby, their rifles resting against a log. Grant crouched low, hand on his gun. "We'd do this quiet," he whispered. Lena nodded, eyes locked on the sheriff. They moved as one. Grant circled left, using the brush for cover. Lena crept along the right, her footsteps silent on the dry earth. But just as Grant raised his rifle, a twig snapped under Lena's boot. Dalton's head jerked up. "Well, I'll be damned," he drawled, pushing himself to his feet. "McCade!" "I knew you'd come sniffing around eventually." He motioned to his men. "Guns up, boys." Grant stepped out of the brush, rifle leveled. "It's over, Dalton. You and I settle this now." Dalton grinned, his teeth flashing in the firelight. "Funny, that's exactly what your old man said to Cartwright before he burned his house down." Grant's grip tightened. "Don't you dare say his name." "Why not?" Dalton sneered. "It's history, son. We were the same, just trying to build something in the ashes. Only difference is I didn't grow a conscience about it afterward." Lena stepped out beside Grant then, gun trembling in her hand. "You built nothing but graves," Dalton laughed. "Well, look who finally found her tongue. Little Cartwright herself. Still think you're owed something?" "'Cause last I checked, your kind were meant to disappear." Grant fired. The shot rang through the valley like thunder. One of Dalton's men fell instantly. The other scrambled for his rifle. "Down!" Grant barked, pulling Lena behind a fallen log as bullets tore through the air. The fight was fast and brutal. Dust and smoke blurred the world into chaos. Grant's rifle cracked again and again until the chamber clicked empty. He ducked low, reloading by instinct. Across the fire, Dalton shouted, "You think this changes anything, McCade? You're still one of us." "You'll die one of us?" Grant rose from cover, his voice steady. "Not anymore." He fired once more. Dalton's gun dropped from his hand. He staggered, clutching his chest, eyes wide with disbelief. Lena stood frozen, the echo of the shot hanging in the air. Dalton sank to his knees, then fell forward into the dirt, the firelight painting his lifeless face in gold and shadow. For a long time, neither of them moved. The fire crackled, the wind sighed through the trees. Lena finally lowered her gun, her hands trembling. "It's over?" Grant nodded slowly, staring at the man he'd once feared and pitied. "It's over." She turned toward him, her voice shaking. "You didn't have to do it." "Yes, I did," he said quietly. He would have kept coming. He always would. Lena's eyes filled with tears, not for Dalton, but for the years of pain he'd carried. "You think killing him will make it stop?" "No," Grant said. "But maybe now it can finally rest." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she stepped closer, reaching up to touch his shoulder. "You don't owe the dead anymore, Grant. You've paid enough." He looked at her, really looked. And in that moment, something in him broke. The weight of all the years, all the ghosts, all the guilt, it cracked open and let the light in. He pulled her into his arms. At first she stiffened. Then she let herself fall against him, her forehead pressed to his chest. His hand came up to her hair, holding her like he was afraid she'd vanish. Neither spoke. The silence between them said everything that words never could. When they finally pulled apart, the dawn was spreading pink across the sky. Grant glanced toward the horizon. "Let's go home," Lena nodded, wiping her eyes. "Home," she repeated softly, like it was a word she was still learning to believe. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was high. The fields glowed gold again, untouched by the violence they'd left behind. Grant dismounted slowly, the ache in his bones catching up to him. Lena slid down beside him, steady despite her exhaustion. He looked at her. "You did good out there," she smiled faintly. "I learned from the best," he chuckled under his breath. "I'm not sure that's true." She met his eyes, serious now. "It is." He looked away, pretending to check the saddle straps just to hide the way her words hit him. That evening, the two of them stood side by side on the porch as the sky burned red. The air was still, heavy with heat and memory. Lena spoke first. "You ever wonder if people like us are meant to find peace?" Grant's voice was quiet. "Maybe peace ain't something you find. Maybe it's something you build," she smiled softly. "Then we better start building." He looked at her, that same flicker of warmth in his chest. "Guess we already have." The wind picked up, carrying the faint smell of rain, the kind that promised renewal, not ruin, for the first time since the war. Grant McCade felt like the world had given him back something he'd thought was gone forever. Hope. That night, under the stars, Lena stood by the fence, her shawl wrapped tight. Grant joined her quietly. She glanced at him. "You think the dead ever forgive us?" He shook his head slowly. "I don't think they need to. I think they just wanted us to live." She smiled, tears in her eyes. "Then maybe we finally are." He nodded, his voice soft. "Yeah, maybe we are." They stood together in the moonlight, the wide Texas sky stretching endless and clear above them. The ghosts were gone. Only life remained. The days that followed were quiet, eerily so. The wind that used to rattle the windows now whispered softly through the grass. The ranch, once haunted by echoes of pain and guilt, began to sound like home. Grant and Lena settled into something unspoken but steady. They worked the fields, mended fences, and shared meals at the same worn wooden table. The air between them was lighter now, not without its ghosts, but filled with something else, something alive. Sometimes Lena caught herself humming while she cooked. Sometimes Grant caught himself smiling without reason. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But for the first time, it was peaceful. One afternoon, as the golden light of late summer poured through the kitchen window, Lena stood kneading dough. Her hands moved with practiced rhythm, flour dusting her wrists. Grant leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching quietly. "You're staring," she said without turning. He grinned. "Maybe I'm just thinking. About what?" He paused, then shrugged. "About how I almost missed this." She looked over her shoulder, one brow raised. "Missed what?" He gestured to the room, the table, the window, her. "All of it. You, this place, life." Her hands stilled. She looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that saw straight through a man's defenses. "You didn't miss it," she said softly. "You just took the long way home." That evening they sat outside, the sky painted with streaks of violet and rose. The fields swayed gently in the wind, and the first stars began to appear. Grant poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his. Neither spoke for a while. Lena finally broke the silence. "I keep thinking about that first day." "The auction?" Grant's jaw tightened slightly. "I try not to," she smiled faintly. "I do. Because it reminds me how far we've come." He met her gaze, the fading sunlight catching in her green eyes. "You shouldn't have had to go through any of that." "Maybe not," she said. "But if I hadn't, I wouldn't have found my way here." He nodded slowly, his voice quiet. "You make it sound like I was worth finding." Lena laughed softly. "You were just stubborn enough to be found." Later that night, after the dishes were washed and the lamps were dimmed, Grant found her sitting by the window. The moonlight traced the outline of her face, calm and thoughtful. You ever think about leaving again? He asked. She turned to him, shaking her head. Not anymore. Why? She smiled, a slow, quiet smile. Because for the first time, I don't have to run from anything. And neither do you. He walked closer, stopping beside her. You think we can make it last? Her gaze met his. If we wanted to. Grant reached down, took her hand gently, and for the first time didn't pull away. Her fingers tightened around his, soft but sure. They stayed like that for a long while. The world outside hushed except for the steady chirp of crickets. A week later, the town gathered for the harvest fair. It was the first time Grant and Lena had ridden into town together since the day he'd bought her freedom. Heads turned as they arrived, some curious, some judgmental, but neither of them cared anymore. Harris Dunn waved from a booth selling apple cider. Well, I'll be damned, he said with a grin. Didn't think I'd see the two of you off that ranch, Grant smirked. Needed a reason to shave. Lena laughed, the sound light and genuine. Harris winked. Looks like you found your reason, friend. As they walked through the fairgrounds, children ran past, music played, and for once, the world felt normal. At the edge of the square stood the church bell, the same one that had tolled the day of the Cartwright fire so many years ago. Lena stopped in front of it, staring up. Grant stepped beside her. You all right? She nodded slowly. It used to sound like an ending. Now it just sounds like life going on. He looked at her with something deep in his chest, a quiet awe. You've got a way of turning pain into something beautiful. She turned to him, smiling softly. Only because someone gave me the chance to try. That evening after the fair, they rode home in silence. The moon followed them over the hills, silver light bathing the land. When they reached the ranch, the lantern on the porch flickered in the wind. Lena dismounted first, her dress catching the light. Grant followed, slower, thoughtful. As she started toward the steps, he called out quietly, Lena. She turned. Grant took a deep breath. I've spent half my life paying for sins that weren't mine to start with. But the other half? He paused, voice rough. The other half I'd like to spend building something with you, if you'll have me. Her breath caught, her hand still on the rail. Grant! He stepped closer, eyes steady. Not as debt, not out of pity, but because you're the first person who's ever made this place feel alive again. Lena's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was clear. You don't have to ask. He smiled faintly, the lines in his face softening. Maybe I do. She took his hand, the moonlight catching the faint silver scar on her wrist, the one he'd bandaged all those years ago. Then my answer, she whispered, is yes. The next morning, the ranch came alive with laughter. Harris arrived with a preacher and a handful of neighbors gathered under the cottonwoods. It wasn't a grand wedding. No fine dresses, no orchestra, no guests from faraway towns. Just two people who had survived the fire, the war, and the silence, and somehow found their way back to love. When the preacher finished, Grant leaned close and kissed her gently. The crowd cheered. The wind carried their laughter, and for a moment, it felt like even the land itself was smiling. Lena Cartwright, no. Lena McCade stood beneath the wide Texas sky, her hand in the man who had once been her captor, then her savior, and finally, her partner, and together they watched the horizon, where dawn met the earth like a promise kept. That night, as the lanterns flickered in the house and the crickets sang outside, Grant spoke softly, almost to himself. I used to think the war took everything from me, he said. Turns out it just led me to what I needed to find. Lena smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. And what's that? He looked down at her, his voice barely a whisper. A reason to live again. The wind stirred the curtains, carrying with it the scent of rain and wheat and something sweeter, hope, outside. Under the vast western sky, the ghosts of the past finally drifted away. And in their place, a love as steady as the land remained,